And there the lion's ruddy eyes shall flow with tears of gold, unpitying the tender cries, and walking round the fold. Welcome to Troubadour Podcast. Today I'll be reading Night by William Blake in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. Now, I think this is, again, like many of the other poems we've been reading in this series, a very deceptively simple poem. I think it's a little confusing when you first read it. But I would say it's one of the more complex poems overall in this series of Songs of Innocence. And it has a lot of meaning, and I think there's a lot of interpretation that can happen in it that is, I believe, done on purpose. But with real rigorous investigations, I think you can come to some kind of understanding of what William Blake is trying to say. So if this is the first of the series that you're listening to, great, welcome. I have the podcast, Troubadour Podcast, where I have been reading Songs of Innocence and Experience, published in 1794 by William Blake, one of the big six English romantic poets. William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the first generation. And then you have John Keats, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley in the second generation. Now, William Blake is the most Christian of all of them, but he's still a romantic, and he's against all forms of oppression and repression. That means he's against the church, which he felt was a big oppressor and cause of repression. But he loved the imagery, which you're going to get a lot of allusion to Christianity in here, because he loved that. He was a big fan of the imagery of Christianity, and in fact expanded on it in many ways. So what we're going to be looking at, what we've been looking at in this series, is going through the Songs of Innocence. What I have been encouraging you to do is, even if this is your first episode, try your best to go back or to read some of the other ones on your own, because it really helps to have the total context. If you go to troubadourmag.com, you can or go to the podcast. I'm on Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can go through it with me, and I try to help you have that context, and that really fills out, because this is meant to be a total work of art. In fact, let me show you the plates that William Blake handmade and hand-colored in the 18th century. So when these were first published, he did not intend for his poems to be read in the way that I'm going to be reading them, which is black text on a white piece of paper. He wanted you to read them, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or troubadourmag.com, he wanted you to experience the imagery, the artistry that he was creating, the colors. They were not accidental. So in this particular picture, and if you're listening only, that's great. You can Google Night poem by William Blake, and you'll see on Wikipedia or other places the image. Or you can go to troubadourmag.com, and I'll post them in there with the video and the audio on a special post. But what you'll see is on the first plate, and just as a reminder, these plates were created by Blake. He drew them out, and then he would print out a certain number of copies, and then in those copies, each copy, so let's say 10 people ordered this Songs of Innocence and Experience, so he had those 10 plates that he already had made. He would print out 10 copies of them, and then he would hand color each and every one. Now think about that for a second, because that is a lot of dedication. And one thing it means is that he's not going to be super popular, but it's to him, that personal feeling of craftsmanship is an individuality, that each copy is going to be slightly different. They're not going to be 100% the same no matter what, because he's hand coloring each of them. Even though they're all going to be very similar, there's still going to be a little bit of difference to them. And he's not going to be able to do a lot of them. So he doesn't become really popular, I don't think, until the 20th century. And he becomes very popular in the 1960s, which we'll talk a little bit about And this is partly, I think, because of his anti-repression themes that he has. Okay, so in this first plate, if you are able to look at it, you'll see there's a vine with some angels, kind of almost like birds in there, kind of intertwined in the vine. The text of the poem itself, the sun descending, and I'll read that in a second, is gold. It's got like a reddish. The text itself is kind of reddish, and then it's kind of colored around it with the gold. Now, around the edges, of course, is darkness and night, and we've seen that with the Echoing Green poem, where you have it's all very bright and colorful, but then right in the edges you see this darkness. So it's like this looming darkness that's coming in, and that's part of what's happening in the Songs of Innocence. There's a kind of a level of experience in the Songs of Innocence, and there's a level of innocence in the Songs of Experience, right? Those are showing the two contrary states of the human soul, is his fundamental viewpoint. That there's these two things, innocence and experience, that are constantly battling it out within us humans. Get that. There we go. Now the second plate is quite tonally different. So you have darkness. The text is all dark. Behind it is kind of a dark green. It's in a tree. It's, the text is kind of the leaves of a tree. It's obviously night. You see like little stars in the background. And then on the ground, you now have these what look like angelic figures haloed. Now, I wanted to show that to you just so you can get an idea of that's how people experienced it back in 1794. And it's important also because if you noticed, as I pointed out, you have a kind of a daytime look at the first one where it's turning into night, and then a nighttime look in the second plate. And it's broken up into 3 stanzas for each. This is not done accidentally. It's done very much on purpose. And so when you're looking at it, you need to take into consideration the form and the structure of it. And there's going to be a shift to look for and to think about and study in the second stanza, or the second half, the second 3 stanzas versus the first 3 stanzas. Okay, so let's read this poem, and then we can kind of explore what we think it means. Let's get this up here. Okay. So I'm going to read it. If you're listening, great. I'll try to read it slowly. It does help if you can read the text, I think, but doesn't matter. We'll be reading through it a couple times to get an understanding of it. Night by William Blake. The sun descending in the west. The evening star does shine. The birds are silent in their nest, and I must seek for mine. The moon, like a flower, in heaven's high bower, with silent delight, sits and smiles on the night. Farewell, green fields and happy groves, where flocks have took delight, where lambs have nibbled, silent moves the feet of angels bright. Unseen they pour blessing and joy without ceasing on each bud and blossom and each sleeping bosom. They look in every thoughtless nest where birds are covered warm. They visit caves of every beast to keep them all from harm. If they see any weeping that should have been sleeping, they pour sleep on their head and sit down by their bed. When wolves and tigers howl for prey, they pitying stand and weep, seeking to drive their thirst away and keep them from the sheep. But if they rush dreadful, the angels, most heedful, receive each mild spirit, new worlds to inherit. And there the lion's ruddy eyes shall flow with tears of gold, and pitying the tender cries, and walking round the fold, saying, wrath by his weakness, meekness, and by his health, sickness is driven away from our immortal day. And now beside thee, bleating lamb, I can lie down and sleep, or think on him who bore thy name, graze after thee and weep. For washed in life's river, my bright mane forever shall shine like the gold as I guard o'er the fold. Okay, so now let's break this down a little bit. And again, as I say in hopefully all my episodes, just as a reminder, if this made no sense to you, good, you're human. Because if it did make a lot of sense to you, then maybe you're some kind of enlightened being. It didn't make much sense to me the first couple times I read it. It still eludes me in many ways. And I think this is part of the brilliant effect that poetry can have, that it's like an ice on, the meaning is like ice on a hot stove, as Robert Frost put it. And it feels like that. It's like the melting of ice on a frost, where it's like it's there, but it's like dissipating the more you think about it. And there's something, I think, profound about that, because I think that also relates to how we understand concepts, that as we experience more in life, the concepts we thought we knew kind of expand and kind of alter in ways that make us think maybe we didn't really understand that idea. And I think poetry really gives us that kick in the gut feeling that we're not sure what something means, but we do know what it means at the same time. Okay, so let's look at this and see what the heck is going on to the best of our abilities. So the sun descending in the west. We're going to get this picture in this first stanza. The sun descending in the west, the evening star does shine. The evening star is usually Venus. That's Venus, the planet, mostly because it was bright enough to see, of course. But Venus is also Aphrodite. So we're talking about, in terms of Greek mythology, the goddess of love. And so we're getting painting a picture here. The evening star does shine. So it's not quite night. The sun is descending. The evening star is starting to shine. The birds are silent in their nest, and I must seek for mine. So there's a question of who this I is. Who's the narrator, the voice of this poem? And we'll kind of try and explore that as we go. But I want you to think about this. I'm not going to give you all the answers that I think. I want you also to think about this. So the moon, like a flower in heaven's high bower. Now, a bower is think of it, it's a tree. There's a branch with leaves on it that creates a space of coolness and shade. Bowers are often used in poetry for two lovers under a bower, or a family under a bower. Often it's a romantic thing with lovers, where it'd be, a man and a woman kind of, doing stuff under, in seclusion. But it also has that element of nature providing protection, nature providing a roof over your head, right? Like it's nature it's not really man creating something like a patio with the roof over it or something like that. Like it's not man-made, it's natural, but man is part of it, right? He's using it without changing it. So that's one way to think about bowers. In heaven's high bower, with silent delight, sits and smiles on the night. So look at the kind of, natural connotations we're already getting. Evening star, right? That's Venus, but it's also mythological. The birds are silent in their nests. So we have, the chirping birds that, also represent nature, or they are natural, but they also in poetry often represent romanticism. And then I must seek for mine, my what? My nest, right? So it's I, the narrator, a human, presumably, who now has to seek for his or her, but probably his. It's probably the piper or Blake himself as the narrator, but it could be her. We don't know for sure. And I must seek for mine, my nest, my home, my bed, right? So humans have their nest just like birds have their nest. We just don't call it a nest. We call it a home with a bed. The moon, like a flower. So we have a moon, that's obviously in space in the heavens. And we're going to make a metaphor with it, a simile so we're comparing it to a flower, and a flower that you might find in a bower, right? So if, again, you're in this bower with a lover, you're lying down in the grass, protected by the leaves above you. And, picture you're just kind of laying back and, then you look over and there's a little flower and you pick the flower, right? Like that's the moon. So it's kind of this big open space, or this big metaphorical feeling of what's called a pastoral poem. So that's what we're getting here, is a pastoral poem. Now, when I think of pastoral poems, just for visual purposes, I think of Thomas Kinkade. Thomas Kinkade, was a popular painter. And if you look at his paintings, especially his paintings, not the Disney ones that they kind of did. I don't know if he did the Disney stuff or if they did it afterwards, but but there's a reason why I think the Disney stuff worked for it, if you know anything about that. But the paintings that he did, especially ones with cottages in meadows and woods, it's quaint, it's picturesque, it's unreal to some degree. There's no dead squirrel and rotting, trees in the corner. There's nothing like that happening, which is much more realistic. There's not, a wolf hunting. There's nothing like that. It's all very picturesque, harmonious. That's what a pastoral kind of feels like. And there's a tradition of pastoral poems, and this is playing on that tradition. Of course, he's going to have a little twist in it, of course, to do it. But it's that harmony. It's the one. It's man and as one with it. There's many paintings with Thomas Kinkade where there's a cottage, man-made product with little steam, smoke coming out of the chimney in the meadow. And the meadow, a lot of times will even go right up to the door. I've seen he has done that, where they're almost a combination. It's almost like the cottage kind of sprouts from the woods. And that's pastoral, the feeling of it, I think. Okay, so we have this moon that's like a flower in heaven's high bower with silent delight. The moon sits and smiles on the night. So it's almost like a cartoon picture. He's personifying the moon. Think about like Looney Tunes or some cartoon where the moon is smiling, birds are chirping, everything's honky-dory. Farewell, green fields and happy groves, where flocks have took delight, where lambs have nibbled, silent moves, the feet of angels bright. Unseen they pour blessing, and joy without ceasing, on each bud and blossom and each sleeping bosom. So the sun is descending, day is going away. The moon is kind of smiling in the corner as this is happening. Farewell. Now we're saying goodbye to this world. Farewell, green fields and happy groves, where flocks have took delight. Where we're saying goodbye to this land because we're going into the realm of night, where we do need protection. So if you think about the connotations, the emotions that night brings, this is when you're scared. This is when you might pray. You do your nightly prayers. That's what you do. Now I lay me down to sleep. If I die before I wake. But that's the idea that's going on, I think, here. And there is a terror that happens where you need to be protected. You need the strength of angels, or at least you want it. You hope for it. Whether it happens or not is another discussion, or another another question to ask. So we're saying goodbye to these things, the happy delights. And, where lambs have nibbled, silent moves, the feet of angels bright. Unseen, they, who are they? The angels. What do? They pour blessing and joy without ceasing on each bud and blossom and each sleeping bosom. And I think this is happening during the daytime. It's just that daytime is just like the blessing era, where everything's beautiful, perfect, happy groves are happening. Now, in the next stanza, this is the third stanza. So we're still in that. If you looked at the text here from William Blake's coloring, it's all gold. Although it does at the end start to get a little darker. So that's the angels, look in every thoughtless nest. Now that's again, now we're combining humanity with nature completely. And every thoughtlessness. So, birds are thoughtless, but when you're asleep, you're thoughtless, right? You're unconscious. And that's one of the reasons why you're vulnerable, right? That's why it's scary sometimes. That's why you say a prayer, because maybe a wolf or a snake or a lion will come and eat you. Bad things can happen at night. That's when we're scared. And, but the angels are going to look at every thoughtless nest where birds are covered warm. They visit caves of every beast to keep them all from harm. So there's a harmonious thing about protecting all of creation. And then it goes on, if they, the angels, see any weeping, right? Someone or something crying. Well, why might you be crying at night? There's a lot of reasons. Maybe you're being hunted, right? Like think of a bunny rabbit being hunted by a wolf. If they see any weeping that should have been sleeping, they pour sleep on their head and sit down by their bed, right? And this, you could also, again, now humans are at one here. Now we have bed instead of nest. So you can also imagine maybe some little boy, which we've seen in other poems in this series, like the little black boy, like the chimney sweeper, where little Tom Dacker is crying because he's a chimney sweeper, watch that episode. It's been a popular one of mine so far because I do a very big overview of the history of chimney sweeping at this era, especially, and how deadly it was and why only little children of certain ages were able to do many of the jobs and it would kill them. And so you have, in that poem, Chimney Sweeper by Blake, you have little Tom Dacker who's crying in his bed at night. And, what is going on here is, again, we're seeing that little boy if we're reading these poems one after another. And the angels, if they see that, which kind of happens in the Chimney Sweeper as well, put some little sleep on his boy and he gets to go to sleep, right? His worries go away. And then the angel sits by their bed. It's this quaint little perfect Christian picture. Now it's going to change, right? So this is, if you're watching on, if this goes away, on Facebook or YouTube, or go to troubadourmag.com, you'll see the darker. Now, this isn't necessarily horror, right? Night isn't necessarily horror, but that's where bad stuff can happen, as we know. When wolves and tigers howl for prey. That's a scary sound. If you've ever been hiking and you hear a tiger, like that would be horrifying, right? Or a puma growl or a bear. Like, if you're hiking at night, that, you'd probably have to change your pants, right? Like that's terrifying. So try to picture that. This isn't meant to be some kind of quaint little thing anymore. We're getting tigers howling for prey. Who are there? So it says when wolves and tigers howl for prey, they pitying stand and weep. Who's they? Do the tigers and wolves pray? Or are we talking about the angels? So the angels pity, stand, and weep. So they don't do anything. Seeking to drive their thirst away and keep them from the sheep. But what do they do to stop the tiger from killing its prey? They just stand and weep. And so one of the questions that should be asked is, what the hell is the good of that, of the use of that? Right? Like, great. Now I'm going to die. Picture it's a rabbit, maybe. Now I'm going to die. And you're weeping about it. Whoop-de-doo. Thanks a lot. Right? And keep them from the sheep. But if they rush dreadful, the angels most heedful, receive each mild spirit, new worlds to inherit. Now, what do you think that means? Think about rush dreadful. I think it's one of my favorite phrases in this whole poem, in a lot of these poems. But if they rush dreadful, Well, what rush is dreadful? A tiger. Well, if a tiger is just try to picture a scene where there's a tiger, like a cat kind of slouched down slowly, and they're looking at you, or they're looking at its prey. And then what does it do? It jumps, leaps, runs really fast all of a sudden. It's boom, rush dreadful, which is a verb adverb. It's just such a powerful visual without saying leaps and kills, right? But it's telling you that it's making you work for it. This is one of the things I love about poetry, is it makes you kind of work for it, which enhances your understanding of words, which enhances your understanding of the universe that you live in, because that's how we as humans understand the world around us. Okay. So I just had to put that in there again. But if they rush dreadful, if those wolves and tigers do kill something, the angels, most heedful, those good old angels, receive each mild spirit new worlds to inherit. So you die, right? Like you say, now I lay me down to sleep. If I die before I wake, okay, so you do die. So, a snake bites you at night. You, a human, let's say. Okay, well, now the angels, God bless them, they come over and they receive your spirit, your mild spirit, and you get to inherit a new world. That is heaven. So you're dead. Okay. And there the lion's ruddy eyes shall flow with tears of gold. So ruddy means red. So the lion is crying. Now the lion we know is the king of the jungle. The Lion of Judah is a ancient Hebrew tribe. And this is actually represented in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by the Christian writer C.S. Lewis as Aslan. And I think there's a kind of this idea of the powerful lion that is over, Lion King, overseeing all of nature, kind of including humans in a sense. There's the king of the jungle. And this king is crying tears of gold and pitying the tender cries. But this is part of life, though. That's the other thing, is this is the circle of life, as you might see in The Lion King. So the tiger has to kill the rabbit, poor rabbit. It has to, because it has to eat, right? That's part of life. But he pities the tender cry as the rabbit's killed, and walking round the fold saying, now we're going to hear the lion speak, right? So we're going to personifying this lion. What does the lion say? Wrath by his meekness and by his health. Sickness is driven away from our immortal day. So what do you think that means? I'm going to say I'm not going to give a full thought on it, but because I'm not 100% sure myself. It's an interesting thought. I think you can really explore this, what this lion, the king of the jungle, who's looking out onto the world that we've seen, that's been looked out on from this broader world, right? This pastoral, the moon smiling down on it. Now we're in more, I guess, of the lion's share. But there is something, let me just put it this way. We're going to explore this more in the poem, The Tiger, from the Songs of Experience. And I'll just say that if you know anything about the philosophical religious question, the problem of evil, then I think this will resonate a little bit more with you. If not, that's okay. I don't want to go into it too much because I want to read The Tiger and do that on its own. But wrath, which is a form of extreme rage. And it's not just extreme rage, but it's kind of a rage of the gods. It's a godlike, powerful wrath. But wrath by his meekness. Meekness? Wrath by his meek. Why is wrath meek? And by his health. Sickness is driven away from our immortal day. Maybe it's saying something about the inevitability or the necessity of this kind of rushed dreadful. Right? How does it go? Rush dreadful. Right? Maybe that rush dreadful is just a part of the necessity of life, as we talked about. And now, okay, so we've had that, So we have that speech by the lion, and he continues into the last stanza. And now beside thee, you bleating lamb, I can lie down and sleep. Okay, so now we maybe shade what he said before. If we look at the totality of what he says, so let's finish this. Or think on him who bore thy name, graze after thee and weep. For washed in life's river, my bright mane forever shall shine like the gold as I guard o'er the fold. Okay, so now I think if we look at these two stanzas together, and especially what the lion says, right? The lion, get this picture of this lion, he's crying gold because he's godlike. And he's listening to the sounds of night, the terror, the death that's happening, the rush dreadful. And then he walks around his fold, right? His people, in a sense, his lion people, including humans. Remember, there's a connection here. There's a harmony between humanity and nature in this world. And he says, wrath by his meekness and by his health, sickness is driven away from our immortal day. And now, so once, maybe what he's saying is once wrath has been driven away, we can have our immortal day. But that happens, as we've seen in this poem, after death, right? As the angels receive you. And in this new world, so we have this old world of night and terror. In this new world of happy days, the lion can sleep beside the bleating lamb. It's not something you would see normally. I can lie down and sleep, and now beside you, bleating lamb, I can lie down and sleep. Or think on him who bore thy name, your name, that is Jesus, who's the Lamb of God. Graze after thee and weep, for washed in life's river, my bright mane forever shall shine like the gold as I guard o'er the fold. So we have this completely different world that we're living in now. A world where lions can sleep next to sheep and they're okay. They're not going to eat them because there is no eating them, because they're immortal. They're in a new plane. And I think that this poem, which touches on fundamental aspects of existence, night and day, innocence and experience, evil and good, and then it asks, can we have this world of good? Is that world of good? Or I think we also get, again, we're going to see this more in the tiger, but this question of the evil that exists in the world and why it exists. And that's just because you can't really get mad at the tiger or the wolf, right? That's just what they are. Although we can see them as somewhat horrifying, but it's not quite fair to think that of them because, again, they're just acting out of nature. Whenever I see these from Blake, these poems like this, I always think of our modern civilized disconnect from the realities of nature. And that's one of the things that always makes me think of. Like, I saw this video. I don't know what this says about me, but it was a video of this older lady and her husband, and they had, I guess, tended for a squirrel that had been injured. And so they have this squirrel, and now it's, healed, and it's this, this beautiful scene. They're going to put it out in nature. They put out in nature, and like a second later, their cat or some cat just boom, jumps in, grabs it. And the thing that always catches me is the absolutely horrifying screech by the woman, right? And I think that in our world today, in our civilized world, we have very little conception, which is why I think these poems about night are very hard for us to really grasp, because we have no conception of the hell, in a sense, the terror that was represented by night and that world of death and rush dreadful. And I think if you understand that's the reality, that the reality isn't, oh, I'm going to take care of a squirrel. Squirrels die. That they get killed by other animals all the time. Animals are constantly brutal. I mean, this is only touching the surface. And if you ever looked at the Animal Planet or anything like that, you know how utterly gruesome nature is. You just look at these things in the absolute. And Blake and people at this time are much more familiar with this, I think, than we are to some degree, because they're out in nature more and they're experiencing it more. They know, and they're closer, I think, than we are to the reality of it. We have to watch it on TV. But I've never been chased by a bear. I mean, I've been at Yosemite and I saw a bear, but I was with a group of people. We got together and the bear would have been too afraid to attack all of us. So it wasn't really a danger at all. It wasn't a big problem at all. We just got to see this bear walk around. That was it. And so it wasn't the same thing as, being possibly the chance of being mauled by a bear. And you do hear these stories today that makes us, that always makes us wonder about how civilization has made it easy for us. Like a guy who gets attacked by a puma, right? When he's just on a hike in LA or something. It's like, wow, in LA? How does that happen? And it's those kinds of things for me that makes me think of poems like this and the world of night and the world of day and the reality of the harshness of the world of night and how that's part of life. And the questions that I think Blake is asking is, can there be a world where that doesn't happen, where it's eternal day, right? And in Christianity, this is heaven. Now, I think one last question to think about is this just pure escapism? Is it in the negative sense, right? Like where it's not confronting these issues in reality. And it's not really thinking about, well, what are real problems that we can try and solve? Or is it trying to get us to think a little bit about the elements, especially in the 18th century, but even today, like, for Christians and such, to think about what is this world that we live in? Is it bad because we have death and murder and sickness? Or is it just, well, he doesn't really have an or, let's just say that. But it hopefully opens up questions about that. And when we get into the Songs of Experience, we're going to have those questions. In particular, one poem that's one of my favorites called The Tiger. We're going to have those questions explicitly brought out. And we're going to play around and understand a poet's view of the problem of evil. So thank you very much for listening to Night by William Blake, and I'll see you next time.